Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Glenn Beckman, Communications Manager at GNSI, your guest host today for At the Boundary. On the show today, we have a discussion that our entire team has been looking forward to for quite some time. We're bringing in a few of the students from our FSP student organization, Future Strategist Program, and we're going to have them in for a roundtable discussion on the topic of their choosing. Before we turn things over to them, though, I just want to give you one final reminder for GNSI Tampa Summit 5, the Russia-Ukraine War Lessons for Future Conflicts. The heat on this topic has certainly been turned up over the last week or so as discussions continue between the Trump administration and the Russians in the search for a resolution to the war. Our conference begins tomorrow, and there's still time to reserve your seat at the Marshall Student Center, or you can also watch virtually. We've put together an amazing lineup of speakers and experts surrounding our keynote speakers, who are John Kirby, former senior White House National Security Communications Advisor under the Biden administration, and he's also a proud USF alum, Go Bulls, class of '85, and GNSI Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. He's also the former commander of U.S. Central Command. We're looking forward to sharing their insights and experiences with all of the attendees at GNSI Tampa Summit 5. Look for registration information in the show notes. Speaking of our executive director, we want you to be on the lookout for the next episode of his video podcast, What's Really Happening? You may or may not know this, and you probably wouldn't be surprised, but General McKenzie is a voracious reader. He's a military historian. He loves writing and talking about books. And his next episode, he's talking about a couple of fictional military novels that had an outsized influence on his career, Starship Troopers and the Forever War. That dropped on our YouTube channel this week, so go check it out. Okay, let's bring into the studio now a few of our students from the Future Strategist Program. Our team at GNSI has long believed that a program focused on students interested in national security would be a welcome and highly successful addition to the University of South Florida. FSP was created a little less than a year ago, and man, we couldn't be happier with its success. Over 40 students are now involved. It's a full-fledged student organization, and they're even planning on organizing their own conference on cybersecurity. We're going to tell you more about that at the end of the episode today. In the meantime, I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Tad Schnoffer, the Strategy and Research Manager at GNSI. He's an ideal person to speak with them about their topic of choice, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. He's an adjunct instructor at USF. He's been part of the Florida National Guard and Reserves for nearly 20 years, and in fact has spent a significant amount of time in Ukraine, both on his own and deployed with the Florida National Guard. In fact, the last time he was in Ukraine in 2022, his deployment ended just a couple of weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. Students have a unique perspective and insight into events of global consequence, but because they're students, those insights can sometimes be minimalized and overlooked. And that's the reason for today's roundtable. We want to hear what's on their minds. Tad, over to you.
All right, welcome to another edition of At the Boundary podcast. I'm here with four amazing students from the University of South Florida, and we're going to discuss the war in Ukraine and some of its implications on future conflicts, especially leading up to our conference, the GNSI Tampa Summit Conference next week. So why don't we have our students introduce themselves first? Nico, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you. A pleasure to be here. My name is Nico Laveau. I am a sophomore in the Judy Genshef Honors College, studying political science with a minor in sociology, and I'm also a student analyst here at the GNSI. Glad to be here.
Awesome. I'm also very thankful to be here. My name is Garrett Donahue. I'm an information science major, minoring in geographic information systems. I'm very excited for the conference that's going to take place next week. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is May Birch. I'm a second-year international studies major with a legal studies minor. I'm within the Future Strategist Program under GNSI. I'm the president of that, and I'm excited to be here.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Fu. I'm also with May at the Future Strategist Program. I'm the treasurer, and I'm also presenting next week at the GNSI Tampa Summit on the war in Ukraine, so I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent. Well, to get us started today, why don't we go around and from each of you get your perspective on the war, simply from this question: what's the most interesting or puzzling thing about the war you've seen over the last 3 years? Something that you're really interested in, but you really can't pin down an answer of why it happened or why it took place. So we'll go back with Nika.
What I found interesting recently in the past couple of days is what the Europeans plan on doing with the frozen Russian assets, whether or not they will be using it to fund Ukraine in the face of negotiated peace deals or the U.S. pulling out.
For me, I think definitely one of the most interesting parts of the war that's happened so far is the use of unmanned drones and its implications and how it has affected a lot of policy and obviously a lot of the troops on the ground and how it's being utilized, where it's going to go, where it came from, and all the other implications that come from it economically as well. It's just insane to see how it has been playing out in the front. And the lack of Air Force as well. I think that's also just an extremely interesting point, the fact that we put such an emphasis on it here. But yet in Ukraine and Russia, it's a very slow process, and it's actually not really as utilized as I thought it would be. So those are two things that are very interesting to me.
I find it interesting. I think that it kind of shook up the global international order. I think that everyone had a much larger fear of Russia's manpower behind this. But I think when watching the war with Ukraine, it's interesting to see the differences between expectation and reality. And I think that will also it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, later, even after the war.
Yeah, coming off from May, I am really interested in the difference between the expectation and realities of the war. I feel like the Russian definitely underestimate the Ukrainian response as well as the Western response to their invasion. And I'm very interested to see why was the Russian calculation that way, as well as how the war impact Russia's position in the world, their economic and military standing, as well as their relation and their grand strategy as well. So definitely a once in a millennia event, I'll say that can change Russia's position on the world stage.
Well, with that focus, why don't we go back to May's point? May, could you formulate a question based off of that reality versus expectation, maybe looking at the beginning of the conflict?
Oh, yes. I wanted to ask, so everyone expected this war to be short, decisive, and concise, especially Putin. What went wrong? What was Putin's shortcoming in his original strategy? I think, truthfully, I think there are two parts to it. I think he overestimated Russia's ability, because I think that, once again, we all had this expectation that Russia is a global superpower and that they would be able to easily crush any country around them. But I think in overestimating Russia's abilities, he also underestimated Ukraine's abilities and their willpower to fight against Russia. I think he assumed this would be simple, because I think he assumed that the Ukrainians would also simply submit after enough time at war, which I think has easily been debunked. So I think, truthfully, he did not get, I think, a good grasp of the situation before fully diving into it. And I think that is why he expected the war to be so short when it did not actually turn out to be.
Right. Well, obviously, Russia borders Ukraine. Russia has intelligence assets. There's a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine. What kept Putin from understanding the situation on the ground better? Going to your point of why we think, again, obviously we're speculating. Putin hasn't told us exactly what he was thinking. So we're speculating on why Putin and maybe his inner circle decided to invade. But what kept them from having the information you're talking about, in your opinion?
In my opinion, I think sometimes when you are surrounded by your inner circle and they're supporting your decisions, it's not always as easy to open up to the idea of you simply being wrong. So while they do border each other, and I'm sure intelligence was telling a different story than Putin's original thought, I would argue that his inner circle has kind of supported this war. And when you and your inner circle have the same concepts and ideas, despite what the rest of the country says, it can lead to pretty disastrous outcomes. And I think it has led to disastrous outcomes in the past with leadership unwilling to listen to like the entirety of the society. So I think truthfully, while he may have, he likely was receiving that information about Ukraine beforehand, I think that it likely did not faze him as much as it should have. And it didn't factor into his decision as much as it should have because he had already made up his mind to some degree.
I think it deals with a lot of ego as well. Branching off what May said, I think everything was kind of spot on what she said, but a lot of ego, a lot of betrayal. I think we saw that roughly at the beginning when, a lot of generals and such would just take what they wanted and leave. I think May nailed the nail on the hammer with that one.
In the literature, and we see this often with wars, is that decision makers that start wars typically are working off of what's called imperfect information. They don't have all the information at hand, either because it's denied to them, they simply just don't have the resources to gather it, or they're going to May's point in an echo chamber, right? The information's out there, their defense forces or their intelligence sources have it, but it doesn't filter its way up to the top where the decisions are being made because, again, it's being kept from the boss and, quote unquote. Additionally, expectations and bias from what you want to happen. You tend to look at information and try to create a path to the goal you're looking to achieve. In this case, you cherry pick information that best suits your strategy. So what's possible, going to this point with Putin's decision-making, is that they expected the Ukrainians wouldn't fight as well. They might not have had the will to resist across the board. They might have speculated that, particularly in the east, where it's more Russian-speaking in Ukraine, the Russian forces might have met less resistance or even been supported in some ways by the population. And more of that imperfect information, they weren't sure how much support Ukraine would get from the West. So they knew that Western powers would likely sanction them. But that's not a very good deterrent. Sanctions are not going to deter a country from invading. But they may not have anticipated such a robust response in financial and military aid from the West. So those all come into some of the issues that Putin likely did not anticipate, at least to the degree that we have seen, because that would show why the wars lasted longer. Even Western analysts thought the war would only last a week or so, or at least the Russians would be in Kyiv in a week. Maybe the war would go on longer. So at that beginning point, those are some of the issues that might have been at play. In addition, the Russian buildup in May of 2021, Putin's famous article in the summer of 2021, declaring the Ukrainians a Russian people. It was kind of a buildup in seeing what the international reaction would be and the reaction from the Ukrainians for that matter. And it would seem that the reactions were not robust enough to deter or change the thinking of the small leadership node in Russia that made the decision to go to war. Some of the other points to look at is also the number of forces that the Russians had on the border at the time. Is a relatively small number of forces to invade a country as large as Ukraine when it comes to territory size as well as population. You need a lot of forces to be able to go into the country, then occupy it, and you even need those rear guard forces, those garrison forces to maintain control. So a lot of those numbers don't point to the Russians expecting a large-scale conventional conflict is what we see today. Well, with that thought process, why don't we go back to Garrett? You had a question on the conflict?
Yeah, no. My question had to do with the reshaping of the balance of power within the world, whether that be between just Russia and Ukraine, where they lie, NATO and its allies, and how they view the conflict, and how this balance is shifting or has shifted, and where do you think it's going?
So you're focusing more on now or when the war started, or just kind of talk about
I think as the war has progressed from when it started to where it is now.
Well, I think the war definitely changed everybody's perception and Russians themselves, their own perception on their own position and power in the world. Right now, back in the day, people used to think that Russia is the second military power in the world, that China is still number 3, and the US, of course, are number 1. But now we can see how Russia cannot even fight a war right next to their border.
Yeah, I have to agree with Alex here. The war has reshaped what we see, how we perceive Russia to be a strong military power, or are they really a strong military power, losing around, I believe, 300,000 of their soldiers the past 3 years in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, we also see them as, we know they're not a strong military power because we are the ones that are funding them, but we see there's a strong-willed people there that do want to fight back, that do want to control their homeland and take these aggressors out of their homeland. And I think we also see that the Europeans are now starting to wake up and also realize their own potential in their sense of the world of not being second to America, but also maybe taking a stronger charge of their own lands and their own borders, with the Polish people finally waking up and saying, as a European Union, we need to become stronger, we need to become tougher towards Russia and more unified together. So I think by the time the war ends, however it ends, whether Russia wins or Ukraine wins, or it ends in a stalemate with Russia having the lands that they still control, I think in the broader sense of things, that the world will be shaped for the coming decades.
But it's still not appropriate to necessarily write off the Russian military. Russia still has a lot of latent power, has a large population, has a lot of natural resources, and has the capabilities as their industry becomes more war-oriented to rebuild their military forces over the next couple of years. But they certainly have suffered significant losses in Ukraine and were likely not anticipating, as we just spoke about, a long-scale war. We've already, been going for over 3 years with this conflict, and it's likely going to drag on for at least a few more months, if not longer, as negotiations continue. So with the global balance of power, it's actually relatively unchanged in many ways. From my opinion, it looks like the U.S. is still the strongest power in the world. The U.S. still has the only large-scale expeditionary military force. The U.S. is the only one that can reach out across the world and actually put troops anywhere it really wants to. China and Russia can't do that. Russia is obviously having a problem even doing it just on its own border regions. So that type of balance of power perspective has not changed. Now, the Chinese have probably gained a couple rungs on the ladder as Russia, in a sense, has been knocked back. But it's not clear that once this is over, that the Russians wouldn't be able to rebuild relatively quickly. And going to the point on the Europeans, of course, they're going to have to step up. This is a age-old tale of the Americans asking their European allies to do more. The European allies say they're going to do more, and then they don't, and then they start to cycle over again. The difference here is that there's a lot more pressure from the Americans than we've seen in the past with the current administration, really pushing the Europeans to do more, and the threats very, very evident. Because even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not have any aggressive military actions in the European theater. So obviously they, had advisors around the world and fought in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but we did not see Soviet aggression after the formation of NATO, other than suppressing some revolts, like in Hungary in '56, for example. But we did not see any large-scale Russian military operations during the Cold War. So this is different. So the European allies, particularly those in the East, are looking at it differently. And they have a historical memory of being oppressed by the Russians, particularly the Poles. They take this threat very seriously. This is not a new concept to them. The Polish nation was subsumed by 3 other empires for over 120 years. So they're very well aware of what can happen if you leave your military arm to atrophy. You're going to want to keep that a strong arm of government. So why don't we turn it over to Alex? You had a point on policymakers, right?
Yeah. So I'm very curious from your observation of the war in Ukraine, if you had to advise policymakers on one major security blind spot that they should be paying more attention to, what do you think it would be?
American policymakers?
Yes.
From the American policymaker point of view, one of the big points that they have to look at is what type of Europe do you want and what type of peace do you want? Now, obviously, the peace negotiations are going on. And from an American policy standpoint, you have to say, okay, so we need to create a lasting peace. But unfortunately, in conflicts like this we've seen in the past, whether you're looking at the Korean Peninsula or even on Cyprus, right, you see that you have a frozen conflict. You get typically a demilitarized zone of some sort or some sort of line of contact where the conflict freezes. And then you have a bunch of peacekeepers there. Now, the U.S. discussion has pointed to the Europeans would be the peacekeepers in this case. But the long-term projection would be that those peacekeepers would have to be there for years, if not decades. I mean, look at the Cold War. The U.S. maintained hundreds of thousands of troops in Europe just for deterrence. Not to mention on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. has maintained tens of thousands of forces for over 70 years. So to maintain these types of peace, if the peace deal is not done completely and you end up getting a frozen conflict, could be just putting the issue off for a later date. Now, in the Cold War, it worked out because the Soviet Union collapsed because of economic struggles. But as we see in Korea and again on Cyprus, you still have a frozen conflict with peacekeepers being able to maintain there. So the spot to really look at is how do we maintain? We need to achieve a peace either that doesn't really require that many peacekeepers and has a short-term off-ramp, if you will, or if there are going to be peacekeepers, how does either NATO or the Europeans step up and are able to do that, maybe even through the UN? It's a very difficult, long-term. We're talking, again, this might be 70 years. This might be a date indeterminate to end. So it's a very long-term progression. And we see that with other conflicts as well. If you look at the conflict with Israel and Gaza, right? This is just this current conflict starting back in 2023. That was just the latest spot of violence in this region, and the form of peace deals did not hold. So if you're trying to create a lasting peace, it's very difficult. It typically takes a lot of force, it takes a lot of money and a lot of dedication, and it doesn't have a clear end. And so it's hard to sell to the taxpayers. Why are we funding peacekeepers 70 years after the end of a conflict? So that's part of the issue that policymakers deal with. But what do you think policymakers, European, Russian, Ukrainian, are going to deal with otherwise?
How involved are we allowed to be? And I think it's something that America has been faced with. It's something that the NATO is faced with. It's something that I know the countries surrounding Ukraine, the ones that are holding their breath, hoping that Ukraine wins because they're hoping that Russia doesn't invade them next. They've all kind of been dealing with this because there have been incidents in the past with other countries in other regions of the world where outside countries will get too involved, and it could lead to disastrous outcomes, maybe potentially worse than what was initially intended, what the initial outcome would have been. So I know this has been kind of something on everyone's mind is how far are we allowed to see this progress before we truly get involved? Because we are assisting Ukraine, and we are sending money, and we are sending military supplies, and we are helping. But once again, the question just always goes back to how far into this war and how far into all the casualties and all of the issues before a country is truly allowed to get involved and they're truly allowed to be in that war and fight that war. And it's an interesting debate because I know, and I think one of the reasons that the U.S. has taken a farther step back is because of past failures, as we saw in the war on terror. And then also, I would argue there's a lot of sentiment that the U.S. was acting as a global police force. And I know that there's a lot of discontent within the world because of that. And I think that made it so that in this war specifically, while we have been of assistance, we have not involved ourselves in the way I think past policymakers would encourage us to do. So I think it's very interesting because it gets to a point where the debate is completely surrounded around the fact of how much are we going to see and watch all of these atrocities occur, and when do we step in? When is the appropriate time to step in? Because I think that's an ongoing debate, and I think it always will be an ongoing debate of what moment is the right moment.
I think that's a good point, May. I think that we'll see an aspect of that after, well, let's say the negotiations end and boom, we have a demarcation line. I think we'll see an aspect of that in the sense of who gets to rebuild Ukraine. Is it the West or is it Russia? Who gets to rebuild and influence the country? And if it's like the West, right now the Europeans are speculating about using the frozen assets that they have from Russia for building Ukraine, for funding Ukraine. Do they get to use that, or does that go back to Russia? Or do we have some sort of Marshall Plan for Ukraine? Who gets to influence Ukraine? And then whoever gets to influence Ukraine, how will that affect, as you were talking about, Dr. Schnaffer, the peace down the line? Because if the West influences Ukraine, then let's say 20, 30 years from now, they're more inclined to join NATO again. They're more inclined to join the EU. But if Russia influences Ukraine, then maybe they could change the country and they could influence the country for it to become a much more auxiliary nation towards Russia, just as Belarus is. So I think we'll see an aspect of that, especially after negotiations end.
Well, yeah, for me, I would say the war definitely has a big impact on policymakers in small states. We don't get to talk much about the small states in this case. And I'm saying small states as in many different neighboring European countries and small states across the world. Since I'm from one of them, we have a lot of country from all the way from Latin America to Africa to Asia. They look at this war and they see a former world order that was based on negotiation and international law to prevent conflicts. and prevent this sort of interstate war got shattered. And they're fearing that if the next day, if a superpower, let's say China, for example, wants to get something of their own, they will not rely on the way we used to do for the last couple of decades, which was through negotiation and international law, but rather they would use force, hard force, like the way the Russian did in Ukraine. And that raised a lot of concerns for small states, policymakers around the world. And I definitely can see that, there's been a lot of attention raising and, people have been focusing more on rearming themselves and preparing themselves for a possibility of a future conflict in many different parts of the world.
In case they can't rely on the United States.
And many other of their allies as well, not just the United States. Yeah.
Well, going back to May's original point of states being allowed to do something, what do you mean allowed?
We'll use the United States in this instance. The United States realistically can do what it wants in this war because there's no really allowing the United States military outside of the president, obviously. So by allow, I mean, what point do other countries agree with and contribute to you stepping in? So there have been instances in the past.
What do you mean by stepping in? Like troops on the ground?
Troops on the ground type, like intervention, actual direct intervention in this war. And so my main question just was always a lot of smaller countries, especially smaller countries surrounding Ukraine, those that were initially part of the USSR, they have had these debates as well, just because if Ukraine is overtaken and absorbed back into Russia, who's to say they're safe from Russia as well? If it seems that Ukraine is losing and Russia is continuing to push in and they're starting to invade the territory, do we step in? Do we stop it? Do we protect Ukraine's sovereignty? Or do we simply watch it happen and we watch Russia invade Ukraine and we watch them overtake Ukraine? I know that's what
the French floated. The French floated about boots on the ground, which obviously ruffled some feathers here stateside, but they were floating the idea of, if, say, Ukraine loses the tide, then we may just have to step in. We'll see if that actually happens. I don't believe it would, but the fact that they floated that shows a change in the demeanor in even the Western Europeans, who usually are not as hawkish as the Eastern Europeans are towards Russia.
And I think that's a great point as well, because, and you mentioned the peacekeeping, it's a really difficult thing to do. And I think it's even going to be harder, as you said, to have a peacekeeping force without the presence of the United States.
I think they are waiting on the U.S. They're seeing what the U.S. will do. The U.S. has kind of always been this leading force of intervention in wars and outside wars. And so I think a lot of countries have been waiting to see, okay, is the U.S. going to intervene? And once the U.S. intervenes, that kind of opens a path for others to step in and stop this. But until then, I think it's just been a constant debate on the world stage, really, of how far are we going to let this go?
I think we're seeing that a lot right now, since here stateside, no one is talking about using the frozen Russian assets in support of Ukraine. But in Europe, the leaders haven't said it themselves, but around political parties, commentators, it's been going around now for the past couple days now that we need to use these funds. We need to show our strength. And the Europeans understand that this is really their only card up their sleeve, since they do not have the manpower that the U.S. has. And if the U.S. decides to do a negotiated peace deal with Russia that the Ukrainians don't like and that the Europeans don't like as well, that this will be their only trump card that they could use to continue supporting Ukraine in the face of any deal made as well.
A lot of questions of what policymakers will be doing inside of Russia, and how they're going to take a step back after Ukraine and realize, certain assets, or, when they invaded Ukraine, it was this concept of, that they claimed that the Ukrainians were being genocided. Or the Russians in Ukraine were being genocided. And, we saw how that turned out and how it was proven to be, still up in the air, but not entirely true. But what's stopping Russia from doing something like that again? Making some bold-faced claim and invading another country on its former USSR bloc to gain control.
Well, it's a difficult question because, of course, there is this idea that the U.S. could be everywhere all the time trying to help every country. But countries, looking at IR theory, international relations theory, and a realist perspective, is simply countries are going to act in their national interests, and they're not going to just willy-nilly put forces on the ground around the world unless they have a direct national interest in it. Now, that national interest is typically defined by the ruling party or the leaders of that country at the time, along with the domestic audience if they're putting pressure one way or the other. These topics are difficult to discuss, but power is the currency of international relations. The more powerful you are, you can do what you want. Quoting the history of the Peloponnesian War, the strong will do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must. So you always want to be in a position of strength. You want to have that power and the ability to do what you'd like, because when you have power on the international stage, historically, it's not a question, are you allowed? It's if you want to or not. And going to the small state perspective that Alex brought up, if you're a small state, you don't have the power to be able to do what you would like typically. So that's issues that states have to deal with in their foreign policy making. The decision makers can only use the tools they have, the instruments and national power that they have, and however strong those are. Before we turn it over to Nico, do you have a question you were thinking about, right?
My question is regarding the peace negotiations currently happening in Riyadh that the Ukrainians don't seem to have a strong role in. If the negotiations were to end with a peace deal made, how would the Ukrainians react? And do we see them accepting this deal made without their consultation and capitulating? Or do we still see them trying to find a way to fight back? Obviously, if they lose U.S. support, then they don't have the financial and physical means to fight back. But I wonder how it'll play out in the end once the deal is made.
Well, I'm sure we're all wondering how it's going to play out, and there's a million different avenues that the peace negotiations can go. But you see a lot of people comparing it to 1938 in Munich with the British and French selling out the Czechs, the Czechoslovakians with the Sudetenland. There are some differences here that need to be pointed out. One, that the Czechs were left out of the negotiations through that entire process. So we're not sure how this entire process is going to go. So just because the negotiations have started between the U.S. and Russia does not mean that Ukraine will not have a seat at the table later on. So we'll have to see how those play out until the entire process is over. So that will answer a lot of your questions on what the Ukrainians do. It depends on the peace negotiations. Peace negotiations typically take a long time. The difference in 1938 was that was not a peace negotiation. That was a negotiation of balance of power between the major powers, while the Czech officials sat in another room and pretty much just got handed a notice. The other big difference between 1938 and today with these negotiations is the Ukrainians fought. The Ukrainians are fighting as an active conflict. So this is a peace negotiations, or a ceasefire negotiations anyway. Again, it's not about just handing over land in an act of appeasement, as we saw with Chamberlain in 38. This is an actual discussion to end the war, and hopefully, going back to our earlier conversation about peace, making an enduring peace, ensuring that peace can actually be maintained, which peace being maintained is costly. Deterrence is costly, as we mentioned in the Cold War. And the other big problem with the deterrence is you can't measure success very well. Right? If you're measuring a war, if you're fighting a war, you can measure the battles you've won. Oh, we've won 4 battles. We've gained this much territory. There's all these metrics you can use to see if you're winning or losing, right? But when you're deterring a conflict, all you can measure is the fact that nothing happened. Trying to maintain the status quo is very difficult, or maintaining the peace, because it's hard to sell. It's hard to sell to taxpayers, particularly as time goes on, whether they're European, Russian, or American taxpayers. You can see this across the board, so it's difficult. For the peace negotiations, we're going to have to see how it pans out. But just because it has started in Riyadh between the U.S. and Russia does not mean the Ukrainians won't have a seat at the table at some point. And again, it's not a like case to 1938 in many ways. So it's hard to make that comparison so quickly. It's just simply there's too many things that are different. So with that in mind, what do you think the future might hold for the NATO alliance, for NATO as a whole? So let's say, obviously, let's imagine the conflict continues to go on. Where do you guys see NATO going?
Honestly, it'll be interesting how NATO comes to play out, because there's really only 2 avenues I see it going. Either the president steps down and Ukraine joins NATO, and then in doing so, I think that would be a deterrent for Russia and likely would lead to peace negotiations that would favor both sides. Simply just because with Ukraine being a member of NATO, that would mean that NATO then has the ability to get more directly involved in this war, because they would have a reasoning behind it, and that would lead to a lot of member nations of NATO wanting to get involved as well. The second way I see this going is NATO continues to have their hands off of this. They don't admit Ukraine until after peace talks and after there's enduring peace. And I think that would lead to the peace negotiations leaning heavily in Russia's favor, simply because Russia is the stronger force out of the two. And I think there was a quote you said, the strong take what they will and the weak endure what they must. Russia is not unfortunately, but Russia is the strong in this situation. And without NATO's backing, I think that makes it so that Ukraine is quite easily going to be within the weak category.
I think that the future of NATO, in my opinion, is a strong one, but it also relies upon what our European partners intend to do. Right now, Poland pays their most per GDP rate. I believe by the end of this year, they'll be paying almost 5%, or by next year, they'll be paying 5% of their GDP into NATO. Right now, they're in charge of the EU. They're trying to motivate their partners in the EU that they need to pay more, that they need to pay more attention to Russia, so that in the long term, that this doesn't happen again, or that Russia doesn't find another way to infiltrate and hurt the European nations. So I believe that NATO now has seen that wake-up call with the war in Ukraine, and no matter how it ends, whether it ends with Russia keeping control of the 20% of land that they have, or somehow Ukraine takes back all their land, I think that no matter how it ends, that NATO will still play a strong role, most possibly in peacekeeping forces, if there are peacekeeping forces, and in keeping control and security of Europe as a whole, since I do believe that long term for now, that the European powers will start to put more of their fair share and will start to input more into NATO, since they saw what exactly can happen when Russia takes over Ukraine. And they also see what happens when they have an administration in the US that is putting pressure on them, and that's threatening to become more isolationist if they don't pay their fair share. So I think now they're being forced from both sides to start to pay their fair share, and the Western European powers, once they start doing it, then everyone else in Europe will start doing it as well.
Nico, I agree with your point that NATO's, I think, goals at the end of the day is going to be a lot on prevention. But I think it's also very important to realize that one of the big reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine was because of the heavy NATO presence in Europe.
He also grew NATO in the end. We accepted, was it Sweden?
Yes, we
during
accepted
the war,
Sweden.
Sweden, Finland. So if he invaded Ukraine due to the stronger NATO presence in the eastern part through Poland, Latvia, and the Baltic states, it backfired on him because we ended up having even more NATO presence next to Russia due to the war in Ukraine.
Yes, it most definitely did. But I think for a lot of policymakers in NATO, though, I think it's still definitely something to look into in terms of directly like Ukraine or some of the Baltic states, even though like Estonia, because I mean they are building up their defenses as we talked about before. But I think it's just an important factor to consider that if it was hypothetically one of the reasons why Russia was to invade Ukraine, I think it's something that will be definitely on policymakers' minds in NATO about them doing it again and a fear of that.
I think that fear will lead to them not accepting Ukraine anytime soon. I don't foresee Ukraine being accepted into NATO, but that fear will lead to the existing members of NATO, especially those right next to Russia, building up their defenses towards the Russian border.
Absolutely agree.
The question would really be is how much did it drive this particular conflict? Now, it certainly could have played a role. As with most foreign policy decisions, it's really a pie chart. There's a number of factors that come into play. We like to pinpoint one thing. It was NATO expansion that did this. It was the Russian Black Sea fleet being stationed in Crimea. That's a strategic point. That's why they took the province of Crimea in 2014. But there's a lot of other factors that come into play. NATO expansion is probably one of them, and particularly, again, if you're an international relations realist and you read foreign affairs and you see John Mearsheimer is a famous realist, he often says, the war in Ukraine is the West's fault, right? Because the West expanded. But we have to only speculate that how do we know what would have happened if NATO did not expand? Would the Russians have just been aggressive earlier? We don't know. But what we do know is that no one's attacked a NATO country yet. So that's part of that deterrence kind of leading from the Cold War. timeframe. It would be difficult for NATO to accept Ukraine at this time or any time in the near future. Just very difficult, particularly with contested borders. And certainly in an active conflict, that's not going to happen, or even if it's a ceasefire instead of a long-term peace. So NATO expansion likely played a role. The question would be how much, and that's how you'd have to ask Putin. Because remember, this conflict, although the large-scale conventional conflict started in 2022, there were Russian troops, obviously with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And then there was the simmering conflict in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass from 2014 all the way to 2022, which included Russian soldiers and included rebel groups backed by Russia. So that conflict didn't end, and that's why it just expanded in 2022 with a full-scale invasion. So with all those points in mind, to wrap up, from your perspective, as we look at our conference next week on the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine for future conflicts, whether that's a China-Taiwan scenario, whether that's a larger conflict in the Middle East, or even possibly conflicts in Africa. We still have the civil war or the conflict in Sudan, as well as conflict areas in the DRC and otherwise. So what lessons for future conflicts have we learned from Ukraine, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, as your closing statement? So we'll start with you, Alex.
Well, this is, in my opinion, at the same time, but I also want to put this out because Garrett mentioned why the expansion of NATO might be one of the reasons leading to the war. Well, I have an opposite direction for that. I think there's a sort of this underbalancing from the United States and Western countries in the buildup of the war in Ukraine that contributed to Putin's decision of going to war. I mean, the events of 2014 happened and we didn't have a good balancing actions against Russian aggression in Ukraine. We let them take Crimea and launch a war in the Donbass region. And the only thing we did was sanctioning them, which didn't really affect them that much. So I can argue that this sort of underbalancing, not the expansion of NATO or both, but this underbalancing plays a bigger role in Putin's determination of going to war. So there are definitely a lot of reasons, as Dr. Schnaufer mentioned, but for me personally, I would say is we need to think about balancing, underbalancing, and effective balancing, especially in future conflicts. If tomorrow China launch a sort of blockade around Taiwan, what's our balancing strategy for them? Are we just sanctioning them? Of course, that's going to hurt a lot of people. Would that be effective? So yeah, definitely a lot of lessons from that one.
With the NATO expansion piece, it really is a chicken and the egg type scenario, because was it the NATO expansion in 1999 that started pushing the Russians to look at the West as an aggressive stance? So there's multiple correlations, right? That's that difference between causation and correlation. We can see a number of factors increasing. NATO is expanding, but Russia is also getting more powerful throughout the 2000s, leading up particularly to the 2008 invasion of Georgia. So it's hard to pinpoint what's that causation, and likely, as noted, it's a multiple factors play a role in decision makers, including, it seems with the Russians, one of the big points is opportunity. There's just an opportunity. There's an opening. And they seized that opportunity, as we saw with the Maidan protests, Maidan revolution in 2014. There was an opportunity, and the Russians took it. So one thing for leaders, just like we saw with the lead up to World War II or World War I for that matter, is you want to close that window of opportunity in the leader's mind. You want to make it crystal clear that if they're going to do something that you absolutely do not want them to do, you make it clear that it's going to be too costly. May, what do you think for future conflicts? What would we learn from the current war in Ukraine?
I think that, and to bring this back to like the shift of the global international structure, I think that we learned these smaller countries can push back, and they will push back. And I think, and this is very much so an assumption, but I think China was watching this invasion, and I think, truthfully, if Russia had successfully done it in the time period they initially thought they would, I think that China would have invaded Taiwan. And I think that this has kind of pushed China to not invade Taiwan. And even to bring it back to the African Peninsula, as you said, I mean, I was in South Africa just last summer, and it's interesting to see, because I think it gave a lot of pause to these big countries with a lot of power, these hegemonic powers that we have in the system. I think it made them realize that they may have a lot of power and they may have a lot of influence, but that does not always necessitate that wars like this will be an easy win for them. And what I would hope is that it leads to more balance, listening to outside of your inner circle, listening to the intelligence and listening to informants and listening to people within that country. Like, as you were saying, how there's Russian speakers in Ukraine, listening to those that have been to Ukraine. But I also think for the international order as a whole, this kind of gives us more of an idea of how to manage these situations in the future, because we watch this go on. And I know there are other talks of how to do this, how to do that. But I think back to China, like if China were to invade Taiwan today, I think that we would much more sufficiently handle that situation, having the experience of Russia versus Ukraine. Russia is a big name in the world. And I think for Russia to struggle with Ukraine, it kind of gives hope to smaller countries that maybe were holding their breath in this, especially Taiwan. But also it gives maybe discouragement to larger countries from doing such invasions, because not only will the other countries kind of stand against this, but I think also the people of the country won't easily back down, as we have always kind of easily assumed them to do.
So Garrett, what do you think? Future lessons learned from this war?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of emphasis on a global intervention. A lot of, as we've seen with NATO and all that, it's a heavy factor, and I think it's going to continue to play a heavy factor in certain policies, like we talked about with China and Taiwan. What would happen if that was to go down? I think globally there's a lot of thought that will go around it, and another huge aspect I think is technology. I think we should definitely look at Ukraine and Russia and the conflict as a whole with this kind of bigger lens, and also understand that not every single conflict is going to be like this.
I think this is a lesson for mainly our adversaries, but even for us right now in these times. Do not underestimate the U.S. and its allies. We have built these partnerships for decades, and I don't think even myself or Americans completely realized how there would be such a strong rally around the flag effect around the U.S. telling the Europeans, we have to fight, we have to make sure that Ukraine stands and fights for themselves. And I think the Chinese have seen that in the sense of, if they were to take over Taiwan and the U.S. were to take charge, how would the allies in the Southeast Asia area, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Australians, how would they play in rallying around the U.S. around the flag being Taiwan? And Russia and China don't have those same relationships with many other countries that the U.S. does. And in times of peace and in times of good times, usually people like to look at the allies and say, oh, we don't really need them, or why do we have these allies? Why do we have these partnerships? But it's really when the times are tough, 9/11 right now, that our allies come to our aid when we call them up, they come to us. And it shows the world that we have friends and we will use our friends to get what we want. And so right now, we need to realize that it was through our friends that we were able to continue to support Ukraine. And for future conflicts, we will be using these allies to support whomever we need to support, whether it's us or a country that we find strategic to our interest.
Although I think perhaps the verbiage, you might want to say cooperate with the allies instead of using them. But
Cooperate with our friends.
Yeah,
but
exactly. Yes.
Sometimes we need to use them.
Excellent. Well, those are some interesting points. And obviously, we'll explore a lot of these points much more in depth next week at the March Tampa Summit, as we bring in experts from around the world to discuss the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine and how they could apply to future conflicts. So thank you all for your time today. It was very interesting getting that student perspective, and we'll see you around on campus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That's Dr. Tad Schnaufer, Strategy and Research Manager at GNSI. Thanks for a great conversation with some terrific members of our Future Strategist Program. Those students have, as the saying goes around these parts, taken the bull by the horns. Go Bulls. What started with about a dozen volunteers has blossomed into a full-fledged student organization with over 40 members. And as we told you at the beginning of the show today, they are already planning and organizing their own cybersecurity conference for next month here on the Tampa campus at USF. May Birch is the president of FSP, and she's here to tell us more about that conference. And for that, we thought it would be a great idea to bring in Dr. Jeff Rogg, Senior Research Fellow at GNSI and the coordinator for FSP. He's done much of the behind-the-scenes work to help launch FSP. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Glenn. And I'm very excited to talk about this conference. Lily Shores is the student who's done a remarkable job organizing it and working with FSP, the Future Strategist Program. She couldn't be here today, but I'm very glad to be joined by May Birch. And May, can you tell us what the status of the conference is?
So far, we actually have almost all of our panelists, but one confirmed for the upcoming conference. It is a cybersecurity conference for those that don't know. It has 4 panels and one special speaker, which will be General McKenzie, thanks to Lily. And so far we have almost all the details planned out. It's planned to be in April 15th at the Marshall Student Center. We are hoping to bring in a lot of students. That's what it's mainly meant to be. It's a student-ran conference. So the moderators sitting on the panels, those will be students. The people proposing policies before each panel, those will be students. We will have students presenting research on posters throughout the event. And then even the volunteers, we are hoping to mainly be a base of students. Lily came to us with this idea, and it's truly a wonderfully thought out conference. We did not have much time to enact this conference, unfortunately, but Lily has done her hardest work. Lily has put in a lot of effort to bring this conference to life. And I'm glad as FSP president that we have been able to help her in this. And we're all very excited to see where this goes because truthfully, we are hoping to make this an inaugural conference. We are hoping to repeat this every year and to kind of help it grow with the help of GNSI and other partners that we have on this, such as Emory-Riddle and even potentially a partnership with the Judy Genshaft Honors College. And so I would just like to say that we're all very excited for this conference, and that as we get farther into the conference and the planning, and we're coming to the final stages of development right before the conference, I think that the turnout of the conference will be quite good. And I think that also the messages talked about on the conference are going to be very important. If anything, I would like to just kind of bring up the panel topics just for 1 second. So the first panel will be on AI and cybersecurity operations, enhancing defense and navigating emerging threats. The second one is zero trust architecture for critical infrastructure. The third one is quantum ready, protecting data in a post-quantum world. The fourth one is securing the digital economy, the future of trust and transactions. And then the one with General McKenzie as our highlighted speaker is digital defense, the intersection of cyber policy, strategy, and modern warfare. I think that all 5 of these topics are very relevant to today, since cybersecurity has grown to be one of the largest facets of national and international security. And I think also that each panel will just have very immersive, very important themes and messages within them that I think that not only should the students take away, but I think that policy makers should take away from it. And I also think that I hope that the experts walk away feeling, the experts on the panels, I hope that they walk away feeling that not only were they able to share their knowledge to these students, but also that they were able to learn from it. And they were able to learn from these debates with the other side, the other panelists on these panels. So.
Thanks, May. And I think I want to highlight some things for the listeners coming from an academic and subject matter expert perspective, that Lily did a fantastic job, not only organizing the conference, but choosing the topics. Again, I have to emphasize that this is a student-designed conference, meaning even the topics. Now, I spoke to Lily a little bit, and we discussed some of the organization and design of it. But as far as the topics, the themes, and the structure of it, that's all student impelled. And that's innovative. That's a different approach than what we see with most academic conferences today, or even industry conferences, where it's done by people who are already established in those fields. To me, the value in this is when you study something so much, or you spend so much time working in a particular area. So what I'm talking about here really are academics and practitioners or industry leaders. You sort of fall into patterns of thought and behavior regarding what you're already immersed in. And what's different is now students have the opportunity to present original ideas. And one of the real key innovations that I see in this conference is the students are going to put forward proposals. Students are going to moderate then subject matter experts who can perhaps, on the basis of their experience, assess those proposals with what is realistic today. But that's not to say, in other words, if a subject matter expert sees challenges in a student proposal, it's still not to say that there's a future there or something that the subject matter experts have to consider. And what I mean by that is having students bring forth new ideas shows you where their mindset is, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, men aren't prisoners of fate, they're prisoners of their own mind. So this helps us break out of mindsets that we all have. And so again, I'm just extraordinarily pleased that students are organizing, designing, and engaging with the practitioners, including who they're inviting to the conference. Truly, I think an innovative design that, as you mentioned, GNSI and FSP hope to repeat in the future.
I just want to thank Dr. Jeff Rogg for being here and for talking about this conference with us and for giving us the platform, really, to speak more on this conference. And I would also like to thank our audience for listening in. And I would also like to encourage all to please come to the conference if you can. And if not, I know that it will be recorded. So I would just highly encourage that you also just listen to the conference as well if you can't come in. Thank you.
That's Dr. Jeff Rogg, Senior Research Fellow with GNSI, talking with May Birch, a student here at USF and the president of the Future Strategist Program student organization here at the University of South Florida. What a great show today. We're glad we had the chance to share with you some of these amazing students and their forward-leaning ideas. Look for more great ideas from them in the future. If you're interested in FSP or know someone who should be, check out our website for more information. And there'll be more details online about their upcoming cybersecurity conference in the near future as well. Next week on At the Boundary, one of our favorite guests returns with more about the crazier and getting crazier world of artificial intelligence. USF professor John Liccato has spoken to us before about AI, and he's an integral part of the brand new college created last year here at USF, the College of Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and Computing. He's going to talk about that, and he's also going to talk with us about things like DeepSeek, Lucy, and a few other developments in that sphere. Now that's next week. If you don't want to miss it or any of our future episodes, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be worthy of attention and discussion. I'm Glenn Beckman. Thanks for listening today. We'll see you next week at the Boundary.